Some historical debates never really end, do they? They feel, well, alive, like they're still being fought today. The issue of temple desecration in medieval India, that's a perfect example. It's this incredibly sensitive topic where history, politics, and identity all just crash into each other. So let's try to cut through some of the noise and see what a more data-driven approach might reveal.
Okay, so let's just rip the Band-Aid off and ask the big question right up front. How many temples are we actually talking about? How many were really desecrated in medieval India? Sounds simple enough, right? Well, it turns out the answer you get, it completely depends on who you're asking. And this is where your jaw might hit the floor. On one hand, you have estimates as high as 60,000. 60,000! I mean, that suggests a massive, systematic effort. But then on the other hand, a really prominent academic count puts that number at just 80. 80. Not 80,000, just 80. That's not just a small difference, that's a whole different universe of interpretation. So what on earth is going on here? Okay, to make sense of that gigantic gap, we really need to look at the two main stories, the two big narratives that have emerged. Let's start with narrative number one. This one frames the whole thing as an issue of religious iconoclasm. The act of destroying religious symbols for purely ideological reasons. This is the viewpoint you'll find in works like Sita Rama Ghole's Hindu Temples. And the argument here is pretty straightforward, that destroying temples was a core goal for a lot of medieval Muslim rulers. The why in this narrative is fundamentally religious. It's about a deep theological opposition to idol worship, which then led to this, massive and organized campaign of destruction. Right, but that's just one side of the coin. Narrative number two flips the script completely. It argues that the real motivation wasn't about religion, it was about politics. This is the perspective you'll see from historians like Richard Eaton. And yep, this is where that much, much lower number, 80, comes from. The core idea here is that temple desecration wasn't some kind of blanket religious policy. No, it was something far more limited, a very strategic move with very specific political targets in mind. And the idea behind this political argument is actually pretty fascinating. It's this concept called shared sovereignty. The theory goes like this. In these medieval Hindu kingdoms, the main state temple wasn't just a religious site. The deity inside was seen as like a co-ruler with the king, a divine partner that gave the king his right to rule. So the temple itself wasn't just a temple, it was a powerful political symbol, an extension of the state. So if you look at it that way, attacking a temple suddenly isn't random vandalism. It's a calculated act of political warfare. If you want to take down the king, you go after his divine business partner. It's a total power move. You're not just breaking stones, you're breaking his legitimacy and asserting your own. And here's a key part of this argument. It claims there was already a precedent for this, that even Hindu kings would sometimes loot the temples of other Hindu kings they defeated. All right, so we've got these two very strong, very different stories. One says it's all about religion. The other says it's all about politics. So who's right? How do you even begin to settle a debate like this? Well, this is where our source material gets really interesting. It tries to break the stalemate by bringing in cold, hard data. And that lets us frame two really clear, testable hypotheses. Hypothesis one, let's call it the iconoclasm theory, would predict that you'd see temples being desecrated pretty much anywhere a Muslim state was in charge. Simple as that. But hypothesis two, the political tactics theory, predicts something much more specific. It says desecration isn't random, it's tied to a very specific event, the moment of conquest, right after a battle is won.
So how do you test that? Well, the methodology here is super rigorous. First, the researchers looked at what happened in pre-Islamic India. When one Hindu king conquered another, what happened to the temples? Were they destroyed? Were they supported? Then they compared that data to what happened after Islamic conquests. And this is the most important part. They decided to stick only to epigraphic sources. We're talking about inscriptions carved in stone, the most solid physical evidence you can get, instead of relying on literary accounts, which can be, a bit more subjective.
So, to put these ideas to the test, the researchers needed a specific case study, and they found a perfect one, the Kakatiya Kingdom, down in the Deccan.
The Kakatiyas, you see, were a huge deal for centuries. They were famous for building incredible temples. But their reign came to a very abrupt end in 1323 CE when they were conquered by the Tughlaq dynasty of the Delhi Sultanate. And just like that, you have a perfect historical laboratory, a clear before and a clear after.
And yeah, this is the after. You can see the ruins of a magnificent Kakatiya temple here. The destruction is pretty obvious, but the real question, the one the data can help answer, is what was happening before 1323.
What does that evidence tell us?
This is why those stone inscriptions are so critical, because the actual epigraphic record from before the conquest tells a fascinating story. It shows that Kakatiya kings were constantly supporting temples, not just their own, but even the temples and lands they conquered from other Hindu kings. Now think about that. That pretty much flies in the face of the idea that there was some kind of existing Hindu precedent for destroying temples as a political tool.
So, when all the numbers were crunched, what did the analysis actually find? Well, the results were pretty clear-cut. Temple desecration wasn't linked to just the presence of a Muslim state. It wasn't happening all the time everywhere. Instead, there was a super strong correlation with one thing: the outcome of a battle. In fact, the data show that the probability of a temple being desecrated jumped by over 30%, specifically in the aftermath of a Hindu state being defeated in battle by a Muslim state. This really backs up the idea that desecration wasn't just random destruction, it was an event, an act tied directly to conquest and stamping your new authority on a place.
And this quote from the source paper really puts a fine point on it. The reality, based on the inscriptions, is that Hindu kings not only never desecrated each other's temples, rather they patronized temples in conquered lands, including state deities of defeated rulers. Now that's a huge finding. It directly challenges a really important piece of the political motive theory, that whole idea that this was just business as usual.
So where does that leave us in this whole debate? Well, the data seems to suggest that temple desecration really was a political tactic, something that happened right at the moment of conquest. But, and this is a big but, it also seems to blow a hole in the idea that there was a Hindu precedent for it. It kind of complicates both narratives, forcing us to look at the whole picture again. And it leaves us with this massive question, one that applies to pretty much any historical debate. When you have these powerful, conflicting stories, what kind of evidence do we trust the most? What really gets to have the final say?